Today, Community Planning Conversation is with Kevin Hamilton. He's a professor in art and design at the university. And the reason for asking Kevin to join me today is he's doing a very exciting project, not one of many he's doing, but the main focus is on investigating how can we get people to walk more. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today. And this started last spring with a symposium, and I'm going to read the title because I've always had a hard time getting it accurate, and I want to do it justice. And it's Walking as Knowing as Making.
Right.
And let's start with that and the thoughts behind that symposium, and then how you've sort of moved forward with that project and showing us some of the work that you and your students are doing.
Sure.
And then we'll expand to your own work of art.
Yeah. Happy to. Yes, the Walking as Knowing as Making Symposium was a project collaboratively with a student named Nick Brown. Nicholas graduated last year from our MFA program and will be returning this fall to the landscape program to get his doctorate. And the two of us started talking when we arrived here the same year. I arrived here in 2002 as a new assistant professor and Nick as a first-year grad student. And we started talking right away about how we had this mutual interest in walking. People are often surprised to hear about an artist being interested in walking. Why is this? Is this walking as art, or where does this come from? And I think it's a good sort of entry into this conversation to just ask people to think about what they associate with art making, especially traditional picture making. Often people associate picture making with looking, right? They associate landscape painting with someone standing in a place and observing what's going on. What do they see? The longer they look, the longer they paint. What colors do they see? What does the landscape look like? What kind of histories does it reveal? And you can begin to expand this to think about how art enables us to have a certain kind of vision of our everyday environment. We look around and we notice things, and it's a common observation that people say we notice different things while walking than we do while driving. Right? You notice things that are changing. You notice your neighborhood more. And with walking, there seems to be almost an inescapable aspect of walking is to notice how your world is changing and what your role is in it. You're not just passive sitting in a seat watching the world go by through a train window. You're active on that world. You can stop and change it as you go.
You're engaged.
Yeah, I think you're physically present.
Right.
And your body is subject to that world, and the world can impact you as well. So it's a reciprocal relationship. That's the knowing and the making, right? Because when you walk, you learn, you take in. We are a creature of senses, and when we hear and see things, especially when we see things change, our knowledge is increased. But then also there's a making, there's a production. We are being made differently, and we are making the world different by our presence there. So that's some of the ideas around which the symposium started. Should I tell you a little more about the symposium itself and how it worked?
Please do.
Sure.
And some of the workshops that you did, where you went out to the rural areas.
Yeah.
All right.
And I can call up some good pictures from some of that as well.
Excellent.
So as Nick Brown and I were talking about this, we were observing that we could find different people talking about walking in this way, but often it was from a narrow point of view, or maybe not narrow, but maybe too specific. We could find artists that were talking about walking, but they might go too quickly to something like sculpture, or even questions of aesthetics, which are important to art, but that didn't really represent everything that interested us about walking. We could find people writing about the politics of walking, how different people feel more or less able to walk in different spaces, how walking involves looking at people in certain ways, not just passive looking, and that there are ways in which it's different for a man to walk in a certain space compared to a woman, or someone of one economic class to walk in a neighborhood of a different economic class. There's politics of this. We could find people talking about that and writing about that, but usually only in relationship to cities, for example, and less so in relationship to suburbs or let alone a rural space. So we kept finding, if you will, people using lenses that we thought were useful, but they weren't all looking at the same subject. And so
And
we
when you
thought,
talk about
yeah,
lenses, you mean personal lenses?
yes, and academic lenses or disciplinary lenses or even,
Camera lenses?
sure, yeah. It's maybe even, for example, we could find people who saw walking as a powerful activity for social and political change, people who walk as protest. But those people didn't seem to be talking to the people who were talking about walking as a place to understand what this word nature means. Poets like Gary Snyder who talk about walking as where we even invent the idea of a wild at all. So we said, let's get these people together. Let's make a symposium that gets people in the same room talking to each other who never would have had a chance to do that before, and for whom the common interest is walking. So that took us to what really ended up being the most interesting part of the symposium, which is that we structured it as a symposium series, in fact. It was 3 long weekends, and for each weekend we invited as few as 3 or 4 and as many as 7 different people to campus. They all stayed out at Allerton Park, which worked out really well. So they stayed together, and we brought them back and forth to campus for presentations and public discussions, and also took them to sites for walks that we'd organized together. And the examples of folks we brought together would be things like in our first weekend was a really amazing combination of folks. We had Ann Wallace, who's a professor of English. Her area of expertise are English poets like Wordsworth, people for whom walking seems to recur in their poetry, people for whom even the rhythm of their poetry starts to make you think of footsteps. And we put her together with Dennis Banks, one of the founders of the American Indian movement, who really went to walking and sometimes running as a very early symbolic gesture and also experiential gesture of protest and return to the ways of his people that he felt he had not been educated in as a child. We also included that weekend John Francis, who John decided to stop riding in cars, and that was back in the early 70s, and he didn't ride in any vehicle for 24, 25 years, and walked around the world during that time and became a UN ambassador during that time. So we had those 3 together with one other person, Hamish Fulton, who is an artist. He's an artist from England who's been making walks as artwork for many years, but it's very esoteric stuff for most people. He's climbing mountains, he's walking in the desert. It's a head scratcher for people. They say, how in the world could this be artwork? But for him, it's very clearly artwork. So this kind of combination of people was really unusual. They had never would have been able to talk to each other otherwise. And so each person would give a presentation, and then we'd try to facilitate some discussion between them.
And just for the viewing audience, how I discovered Kevin was when I read about the symposium and actually kidded him a bit that there were no urban planners involved in this. And since urban planning really focuses a lot on urban design and urban space and how we walk, but it became very apparent that we're viewing it from sort of the concrete, meaning laying down spaces to walk within, whereas you were really focusing on a very aesthetic lens.
Or perhaps less aesthetic, but maybe perhaps more practiced, more experiential. I mean, Sharon Irish was a big part of our project. She's a researcher in architecture, so she was able to bring some of that to us a bit. But yeah, you're right. We didn't get into the direct sort of walkable city kind of discourse so much.
Or the work that people in kinesiology are doing
Yeah.
now related to walking and obesity.
Yes. And
So
that's,
many different ways to look at walking.
yes, and it's some of those ways we never would have known. And in fact, my relationship with kinesiology grew out of this almost after the fact. Kinesiology was one of our co-sponsors, but it wasn't until late in the symposium series that I really started finding exactly what Waymo Zhu and I had in common in terms of interest, and that's actually the conversation from which this more recent project grew. which maybe I can get to that in a minute. It might be good. I could
Would
show
you like to
yeah,
show some of the pictures?
me-
All right.
let me show you some pictures of a walk we took back in that original symposium that would be interesting to folks, I think, around here. We took a walk down in Whiteheath. Do you know where that is?
Yes, I do. And while he's hunting for the pictures, this is really terribly interesting because even though they weren't looking at the design aspect, we are learning a great deal related to good design and how that encourages people to get out of their cars and actually walk. You need interest to get people to walk. Design needs to have some aesthetic value to it, and there you go. You have some
Yeah,
of the.
great. So, yeah, I'll just put some pictures up here, and then I'll come back to some pictures of ourselves as well. So for each one of these weekends,
Can you get them larger or not? Or is that about as?
I could. Let's see. It would take me a minute to reset the system
Oh,
settings,
okay,
but
that's fine.
that's as big as that's going to get on this particular computer. But just to give you an example of the kind of walks we would take, this is once we had that group together for that first weekend. This would have been in February of 2005, or late January actually, 2005. We said, okay, what are some of the things we're looking at about walking here? We're looking at walking as something that you experience with your body, like the kinesiologist might look at. We're looking at how, okay, walking has a certain kind of rhythm and has a certain kind of duration. We're looking, like I said, at how walking invites you to look at your spaces, and sometimes to look at them with information that's not present. For example, walking after you've read a book about the history of a street is much different than just walking down the street before you read that book. We looked at things like how sometimes when you walk with other people, you attract attention. And what is that attention about, and how can it be put to use? And Nick and I said, so what kind of walk can we design for this particular group of people and the rest of the community who would come that would help us look at all these things and talk about them? And it was Nick actually that found that there is a relatively little known trail that goes through Champaign County called the Trail of Death. And it's an analog to the Trail of Tears that we're more familiar with which the Cherokee were forced to march when they were relocated, forced out of the southeast. The Trail of Death was a different forced march, a forced march of the Potawatomi Indians who were forced to march out of, I believe, it was out of Ohio, and they were forced to march out to Kansas, I believe, is where they were ultimately forced to go. And that trail goes right through Champaign County. And there's, in fact, a record that Nick found of a priest that went along on that walk and recorded what happened each night, how many people died at each stop, what the conditions were like. And there's, I think, 3 stops, at least near or around Champaign County that are known. One of them was in Whiteheath, another one in Sedoris, and a couple others. And so we went down to the Whiteheath one. It's a small little town, and I've got an aerial photograph we caught online here, kind of where we started here. There's a park right in the middle of town there, and what we did was we picked 1 mile of that trail and walked along it, because in fact there's a road and a railroad that goes right along that trail now. This is very interesting, the way one trail leads to another, right?
Sort of layered.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so we picked a mile that followed that Trail of Death, that also paralleled a very busy railroad track, that also paralleled an actual driving road that went by different farms, that went by some old bridges that weren't used anymore, that crossed a river. And here in 1 mile we get this rich, dense set of information that we can look at and talk about. And we walked up that street with these folks, and about maybe 20, 30 other people that came. So I'll get pictures of that here. So in these pictures we've got Dennis Banks and John Francis there, starting us off with some music. This was actually a site Dennis was not aware of. As active as he was and is in the American Indian movement, he wasn't aware of the Trail of Death. So this was very powerful for him to visit this place where where Indians died at the hands of whites, really at this forced march. So he was very moved by this and wanted to lead us in some music and some prayer, which is very powerful. And John Francis there, who brought his banjo along, he's the guy who walked for 20 odd years. He always had his banjo. So he played. These two guys had never met, but they played together on songs that Dennis sang. And we walked up and down here. And I should correct, this is in the Sidorus, not in the White Heath stop. This is in the Sidorus. We walked
The Sidorus
mile.
leg
Yeah,
of this trail.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can see we had a pretty good group of people, and it's a very quiet little place, that stretch of road. And for all of a sudden there to be 30, 40 people coming out, walking up and down this road, was not only, that attracted some attention. People drove back and forth, and what's going on here. We did let the town know we were coming. Talked to the main office there, the police and stuff. But
And was Sidorus aware of their history, or
Yeah.
was this new information
no,
for?
there's a little plaque.
There is a plaque.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a plaque there that was put by the Boy Scouts, we think, back in the 80s sometime. So this is this is a good example of how we felt like academic conferences tend to just come and present information. People read papers. In the best case scenarios, there's some discussion of those papers, but as you know, probably that doesn't even always happen. And we thought, we're talking about walking, and it's a bodily exercise. It's not just the mind. And we need to do more than just talk. We need to walk, and we need to react both to people's words, but also to some actions, to some places. So we were able to take Anne Wallace's discussion of these poems from England, together with John Francis's telling us the history of what it was like to walk for all these years and all these continents, together with this particular walk, and start to talk together about, okay, why walking? Why is walking so powerful? Why are there so many different layers here of things that can really transform your world, make you look at it differently? So it was a really good starting point, and that's a good example. I won't go through all the other symposium weekends, but every weekend we had something like that, some group of folks and some planned walk that we drove out to with people and walked back and forth for a while.
And it's so easy to demolish this history as urban change comes along, and we don't remember what is layered underneath there. So this was probably changed the way people thought about walking. Those who joined you on those 3 weekends, and
I think so. It's the history is not apparent. All the, like you said,
Right.
it gets hidden. Sometimes that's for reasons that the history is suppressed, right? We don't want to think about some of these things. Other times, the history is monumentalized. If I think of that, I think in Boston, there's the Freedom Trail Walk,
yes,
which you can walk this path from one important Revolutionary War spot to another. And in fact, the sequence really doesn't have much to do with one another. And this is not Paul Revere's ride that you're walking or something. It's a very particular kind of constructed walk that's it's actually such a tourist destination that maybe you're also a little bit obscured from the history, because you're looking perhaps more at the monument than at that experience. You're trying to get to the next important site and not noticing, for example, what you just passed by you, the person sleeping in the alley, or the gentrification going on in a particular building. So there's lots of ways to miss stuff. So and walking needs to be really attended to really get it, to really see. And we have to study. We have to study together.
slow down.
Yep.
To look at those things, because the one you're talking about in Boston, there's a lot of urban change
Yep.
that's also choking
Yeah, it's true.
in these areas where the Freedom Trail goes,
Yeah.
and hard to observe these.
Yeah, and it takes some work you have to do your research too.
You do.
You got to go look at the maps and see how they're changing from one to the next. This is where we learn a lot from folks in urban planning and in landscape architecture, because these are the folks who are experts at looking at maps, and they can really read. It's interesting, for example, to go to our library here on campus and compare the maps of Urbana-Champaign over the years.
Yes.
And start to see what's different. It's hard to see sometimes to really tell because each map has its own language. But if you look close enough, you can start to ask questions about, okay, why is that road not there anymore? Why did that road change its name? How come this map doesn't include this neighborhood? These kinds of things can then, once you get that information together, then you can go out and walk and compare what you know to what you see. And you can start to read the world that way, like, the world is the ultimate map.
And also question whether these changes are improvements
Exactly.
or not.
Yeah.
That isn't reflected on sufficiently as we then move forward on design.
Mm-hmm.
The loss of the boulevards along Green Street
Mm-hmm.
as a major example on how that softened the communities and changed the traffic
Yeah.
patterns and the trees that were once there and don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So how did you move this forward to this next phase of the project?
Well, this was an interesting thing that happened. Once you start talking about what you're interested in on campus, inevitably somebody in this deep community says, hey, I do that too. I'm surprised you do it. And this happened through an interesting change, interesting opportunity. The Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities likes to put on art exhibitions, and Maddie Bunzel and Chris Katenzreit have been doing a really good job with that. And last year, they had an exhibition of the photographs.
Before we go too
yes.
far, they're
Yeah.
housed on Pennsylvania.
Yes.
All right.
And I think their exhibitions are mostly during the academic year. I'm
Yes,
not
but
sure.
open to the public.
Yes.
Okay.
Good, and Maddie will be happy that we made that point.
Yes.
They last year invited Wojtek Hotchko-Zyko from the kinesiology department to come and show his photographs, which are they're very beautiful. And I didn't even know what I was getting into, but Madi said, hey, we're having an opening. Wojtek does a lot with walking. Would you be interested in coming and just responding to these photographs at the opening for people as kind of an informal discussion? And I said, sure. And I didn't even know that these were going to be all photographs of people walking, but that's what Wojtek has been doing. He takes these beautiful images everywhere he travels all over the world in his research on aging and on physical activity. These photographs of people walking. And so from talking with him there and also meeting Waymo Zhu, who's an associate professor over there, we started to see these other common interests. And in particular, it was with Waymo that a discussion emerged about the need to find ways of encouraging people to walk. Because in fact, the Walking is Knowing Symposium wasn't framed first that way. I mean, it wasn't so much that we thought, at the end of the day, if we haven't made people want to walk more, we failed. It was a bit more of an inquiry than an action. And kinesiology is about the business of action. They need to get people to walk more for reasons of obesity
And
or
health,
and
right,
health, all
right.
kinds of things. And so
Same end result, but different ways.
So Waymo started wondering, is there some way you could help us with this? Is there some way you could devise some sort of art activity that would encourage people to walk? And out of that discussion came this other project. This other project that we're getting into now is the more recent one. This was called Mobile Mapping for Everyday Spaces. And it was a project that was primarily a collaboration between art and design and computer science. Kinesiology is kind of waiting in the wings on this. We framed the project in such a way that kinesiology's needs sort of set up our design problem. And then we spent a little over a semester trying to address that problem with students. And now, at the end of that process, we have some activities that now I need to take back to kinesiology and say, okay, we've dealt with your problem this way. What do you think? So that's the next step. But what happened was we invited, as part of the symposium, the original symposium back in 2000, this would have been in spring of 05.
Oh,
yes.
05. Mm-hmm.
We invited two artists here from Vancouver, Simon Levin.
Vancouver, British Columbia.
Yes.
Not Washington.
Yes. No,
Okay.
good point. We invited Simon Levin and Lori Long. And Simon and Lori work together collaboratively on all their projects. They're artists who like to deal in what might be called public art, but what some folks might call community-based art. They typically will make art by going to a particular place where they're invited and organizing new kinds of activities there that weren't there before. They were here.
And art that then stays, right?
Sometimes it's more ephemeral. Sometimes it's
okay.
a kind of an event, let's say, that gets everybody involved in for a short amount of time, and then all that's left is a documentation of that event.
Okay.
But it's also sometimes physical. Sometimes it will stay. We invited them here as part of the original walking symposium because many of their projects have employed walking through things like the global positioning system technology, which is getting to be more ubiquitous and people know it more. But GPS is the technology that's increasingly in our cell phones and
On our cars.
On our cars,
Just to relate it for people in
Yes.
case they.
Yep, and the GPS technology tracks our location in the world, which is it's a bit of a scary thing. I mean, there's some controversy about this, right? But we're using the satellites up there that were probably put there for military reasons, which we now have access to be able to check our latitude and longitude at any point. And Simon and Laurie have done work with this. They first started doing work with that technology because one of their residencies was in rural Australia, in a farming community. And the farms were so big there that they used GPS on the tractors sometimes for automated work in the fields. And so based on their work with walking, with GPS, we invited them to the walking symposium. Based on that, we then also began a conversation with the Department of Computer Science. And this gets to be kind of complicated, but the Computer Science Department has this beautiful new building, the Siebel Center for Computer Science.
On the north end of campus for those who.
And which people should go by and check out. You know, it's open during business hours, and it's a high-tech place for this community. It's the showcase on this campus now, really, for what it might look like to have a building that is, wired to the hilt. Screens everywhere and technology you can't even see. Sensors. Ultimately, computer science would like to have all the students and faculty tracked in the building to where you could look up and see where they were. This sort of thing. But they, as part of their vision for this building, was that with such an advanced building technologically, there's a new opportunity for their researchers to take their work out of the laboratory and into their everyday spaces that they share. The idea being, as the department head over there, Mark Sneer, puts it, that we should sometimes have to eat our own dog food. That we shouldn't, as science and engineering, we shouldn't just be making things and sending them out into the world without having lived with them ourselves.
Right.
So this is where this vision of the Siebel Center as a living laboratory came about. And part of this involved the invitation to artists to come in and say, okay, you deal with everyday spaces in your work as artists. You're used to making a lot of spaces living, a lot of spaces active and examined, of changing those spaces in aesthetic ways or social ways. What would you suggest we do with this space? And it was in that capacity that we brought Simon and Laurie from the Walking Symposium over to computer science and said, hey, what do you think you might do with this space, with this community? And it was that sort of triangulation between the walking discussion, the computer science department discussion, and the kinesiology discussion, out of which this mobile mapping for everyday spaces came about. And I'll get to some more pictures here in a minute of that project, but the project there was formed as a class. We co-taught this class, Simon, Laurie, myself, and Peter Adamczyk, who's a graduate student in library science and the human factors group here on campus. And we basically framed a semester-long course workshop for undergrad and graduate students from engineering and art and a couple other areas. We said, okay, we want to try to make devices that you can use while you're walking that encourage you to look at different ways at what you're seeing, to use those spaces differently. Back in our conversation a bit here, I talked about how spaces change when you have information about them that you didn't have before. Well, that can come from a book, but that can also come from mobile technology increasingly. If you've got a mobile device of some kind, a Palm Pilot or even a phone, you can be receiving information about that space that can change the way you walk. And with all this kind of technology, with all the tracking capabilities, with all the ways in which people are increasingly wired everywhere they go, we thought, let's frame a problem for students this way. Let's say, okay, you have to make something that's used while walking and that relies on some of this kind of information in the world. What can you do? How can you make walking different using a tool of your own invention? And over the course of the semester, we got some really interesting results. Let me pop through some of these for y'all.
Our viewing audience might now think this is all very theoretical, but actually we can move it out into the design framework on how can we change how we lay things out so it's much more interesting for people to walk and not just think that I'm going from point A to B or I'm just going to go buy some milk.
Right.
But on the way to buy milk, we can do some other things.
Yes, we had...
Actually, the antithesis of this, as you're working on getting those pictures up, is I think about both Dallas and Houston, not to be tough on those two communities, but they are clearly designed to be viewed from a car.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell the difference by the way the buildings are designed, the spaces, the walks, the lack of greenery. And so they're to be viewed as you go by at 30 miles an hour as compared to going by at 5 miles an hour or 1 mile an hour, depending on your pace of walking. Did you find your pictures?
Yep, I've got a few to show you.
All right.
And I think what I might add to that is that if you think about application, which is a really important part of this project.
Yes, exactly.
I'm glad you brought that up. You can apply the desire to walk and appreciation for walking in the design of spaces, but you could also apply it in how we use existing spaces.
Exactly.
And so that the latter is more where we're at. Thinking about perhaps in an educational context or some sort of a community activist context. What are some activities using technology of our invention in some cases that we could introduce that would help people see what walking can do? We actually started them without technology in many ways, and these pictures I've got now. So
and where are you? I'm not recognizing.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Yeah, describe this.
What we're looking at here is a walk. This is in right on the border of Urbana-Champaign on campus, on North Campus on a cold day. What's that building there? That's the newish apartments over there on Springfield.
Okay.
And around Springfield and 5th. 4th.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that helps.
So we're standing near there.
Create a location for people watching this.
And so what you're seeing here is some documentation of these 3 students walking around Champaign-Urbana on campus for an activity we asked them to do. What we asked them to do as a way of thinking about what new information could do to a walk is to give tours of Champaign and Urbana as if they were different spaces than they are.
Okay.
So for example, this is Mike giving us a tour of Champaign as if it was his neighborhood he used to live in Venice.
Oh, all right.
Italy. And we had...
That's the canal.
Yeah, exactly. So,
and we're waiting for the gondola.
Yeah. And we had, tours of all these different towns that people were from even, but just walking around Champaign-Urbana. And it made the person giving the tour had to really think, like, okay, how far do I need to walk before I'm to that little convenience store that I used to walk to get milk when I was little? And for the people who were walking with, they were imagining what's going on in this, like he's pointing, some of these pictures you see them pointing at nothing. Here he's pointing, down to this elementary school where he went, but in fact he's probably pointing to an empty lot or something. So it's an act of play, an act of imagination that, now when I walk down these streets that I walked with these guys, I still remember, oh, this is Tony's walk to his school back in Indiana. This isn't just me walking to work today.
Actually, this is a great game to play with younger children. I mean, that becomes a next interesting step of this project is how can we take this into high school and middle school. I'm sure you're thinking about that, but
and this then provides a kind of an analog or an example for what you might do with technology, because this is a very simple kind of game to play. What are some other kind of games we could play that would help produce this same kind of transformation of your spaces? I'll show you some of those now that.
While you're doing that, causes me to have some interesting thoughts. Planners often give people disposable cameras to go out and take pictures of their community, and they are seeing it from a different perspective because now they're using a camera to view it. But if you take those pictures and really don't do them in a linear pattern, but start moving them around as to how your community could be changed, that's another taking your idea and taking it to another application.
And photography is really important to all of our projects, just that
Oh,
way.
is it?
Because it's so accessible, that way. I mean, there's, with disposable cameras or digital cameras, if you can get them, there's, you can take so many pictures and organize them in so many ways that it can really, it really can work really well for this sort of thing.
It helps people to see things visually then, right?
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in fact, a couple of the projects I'm about to show you have a photographic component. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm so glad I'm having this conversation with you because I can see how I could use some of those ideas when we do a charrette with a community.
Yeah.
A very good application.
And we're, right now, the documentation I'm showing you is all just the pictures we put up on Flickr, which is a free image hosting site. But we'll be, we're right now collecting all these pictures into a more unified website that we can use to really let people learn about all this without me being present, right?
So you don't have them up on a course website that we could give a URL for or something like that?
We do. It's just, it's a kind of a dense site because it's been a course website for the students in the class. But now we're moving, right? We need to make this be a different audience.
Okay.
But there is a website at walking.omweb.org. That's walking.om, as in Mary, web.org.
Okay.
And that's the website for our project.
Okay, there. People can go and look at it.
So I'm just going to walk you through some pictures of our final projects here as they were being demonstrated to us. Each team was interdisciplinary. There were computer scientists, electrical engineers, some person from music, several people from art and design.
But no architects, landscape architects, or
we
urban
had some
planning.
at the beginning, and we had a couple students who were in it at the beginning, and they didn't stay.
They didn't stay, okay.
But we certainly had people coming to see what we were doing from there at times. It's been interesting with all these efforts to do interdisciplinary courses, how it all fits in with people's extant currilla, and whether or not some of these programs are so
locked in.
That it's really hard for them to take something outside.
But it would give people in those last three disciplines that I just mentioned some new lenses to be looking at designing, and we're not really separated.
Yeah, we really wanted them. We worked hard to get them, but didn't come through.
Well, it certainly can, and I see applications for communities immediately on re-looking at how spaces are used and designed, and not just the historical context that you were talking about, but as we redesign spaces.
Yeah.
Do you have your pictures now? Okay.
This is, I'll start with this project called the Velocigraph. This is a project, it's a very simple project, a prototype that we hope to turn into something a little more easy for people to make on their own.
So something designed here on the campus.
Yeah, this is that the students made, and they're demonstrating it on campus. But this is a podium like you'd have right in front of you, and there's a little microphone stand even popping out of it right here, but he's wearing it on his back. See? The podium is used two ways. First, someone wears it almost like a baseball vendor might put their popcorn in when they're vending. They got the podium strapped to their chest with a microphone coming up. And what it does is you can put a book on the podium and record yourself reading a book while you walk.
Okay.
So you pick the book, you pick the text, and you take a walk. It makes a recording that picks up your voice and any other sounds that are around you.
Okay.
Then you give it to somebody else, like we have in this picture. And Peter, Peter's got the podium on his back now, and he's got headphones on, and he's going to take a walk. And now the recording that somebody else made is going to be played back for him while he's walking.
So he's going to be seeing it through the other person's eyes.
Yeah, but
adding on his own.
But maybe more appropriate would be through their feet, because this is what makes this different than just any old recording, is that when the first reader was recorded, it also recorded her rate of walking.
Oh, okay.
And the analogy that the students used here would be as if you're walking around a record player. Your feet would make the record go.
Oh, okay.
And when Peter walks listening, the recording speeds up or slows down by comparing his pace to the reader's pace.
All right.
So all of a sudden the voice might get kind of chipmunky because you're walking faster than
And
the
it was
person
recorded.
who recorded it. So then you've got to slow down to hear it right. And then when you're slowing down, you're actually slowing your body down to the same speed the other person was walking at that place.
Oh, that's interesting. I was thinking of it that it might have been in the other manner, and that is if I was walking too slow and the other person was really walking fast, that changed my behavior of walking because I needed to pace myself.
No, it goes both ways. I mean,
Oh, it does go
yeah,
both ways.
So it's too fast or too slow.
Too slow.
So you get a sort of a herd sort of cue as to how fast or slow the other person was walking when they were there. And because there's a text, then you can start to say, oh, why did they slow down here for this text, for this place? And the example that this student group used for the velocigraph was they were reading a text about particular history of labor unions. And the walk they recorded on was a construction site.
Oh, okay.
Actually, they're around I think it's the nanotechnology lab they're building up on North Campus.
On the North Campus,
Yeah,
all right.
they recorded the walk going around that perimeter. It was very interesting. Labor history they chose to read was about how, with some of the more back in the sort of early 20th century when they started standardizing time shifts and stuff a bit more, the unions would have to figure out how to slow down or speed up labor to make sure they weren't putting some people out of jobs. So interesting relationship here. Let me show you another project.
While you're doing that, this would be actually in planning. We find that both high school and middle school students, and even elementary school students, extremely clever and knowledgeable about their environment. We don't give them enough credit for that, and it would be really fun to take that to that level to get their reactions and what they would choose to read.
Yeah, we were thinking of kids quite a bit in this, and I think, as I said before, the next step is that we need to take this back to kinesiology and say, hey, do you see some applications for this that would be good to use in educational programs, which we believe there would be, and then we would be interested in tailoring some of these projects for kids even, working with people who know those audiences and know those educational strategies to really make it a good, fun thing for them.
Oh, absolutely.
So we're really hopeful about that. This next project I'll show you, again, it's just some still images, but it'll give you a sense of it, is a project that involved our musician, who is a composer. And what this team did is they decided to see what could you do with using musical notation to score a walk.
Oh, actually, psychologists use musical notation to score. Yes.
I didn't know that. What do they use it for?
They use it to score behavior of rats.
No.
Yes, and they
that's
found
really
it a
funny.
nice, consistent way of scoring. But that's an aside.
Well, yes, I'll have to go back and think about that particular.
But what an interesting use of musical scoring.
And so what they envision for their project, this walking score project, is a work in which you could download a score from a website and choose to take a walk with that score. And what it scores is whether you should take big steps or little steps. And that's what we have up on the images right now, is a picture of someone actually carrying out one of these scores.
Oh, I see. Maybe.
So this is someone taking a big step, and then here's
somebody taking.
what he's doing there is taking a picture, because the score has it tells you big steps or little steps, how many steps you should take, and then when to take a photograph.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So right now that walker has followed a certain line of the score and is taking a picture. He's also carrying a GPS unit. And what happens with all this is that once they've taken their walk, they've taken their pictures, they've got all their global positioning data of where they walked in the world, the computer science students wrote a program where you can upload your pictures and data online, and it makes a kind of a drawing
Oh, okay.
of where you walked with your pictures, and it collages them into one kind of record of your particular performance.
Do
of
you
this
have any
walking
of those
score.
that you can share with?
It'll take me a minute to call it
Okay,
up.
well,
but,
we can talk about other things
yeah.
as you are doing.
Yeah, I'll call it up while we talk, but it'll,
Okay.
let's see.
So to help our viewing audience appreciate where all of your talents have come while you're searching for that, tell us a little bit about your educational background and how you got to this point.
Sure, I come from an art background very much. My undergraduate degree is in painting. But yeah, I studied painting, very much a painter from life, landscape painter, still life painter, and then began to get interested in mapping as part of that process, because if you look back in the Renaissance, you've got artists who are learning about optics and learning about different mapping techniques at the same time that they're making still life paintings and talking to scientists. And that sort of intersection of interests in how what we see shapes the world we know led me to want to find graduate study that let science and art come together a bit more, especially in issues of public space. So my graduate program was actually part of the School of Architecture at MIT. They have a small graduate art program there, actually, that from the 60s onward, they've tried to have a few artists as part of the architecture school who, as the architects are looking at urban space and planning, the artists are also seeing, okay, what kind of artwork can we make in these places that can help us learn things about these communities? And a lot of the work that my professors were making and that my peers were making were very politicized examinations of how these spaces work. What kind of histories do we know or not know about them, and how can we bring them back when they're not known, this sort of thing. So that's where I come from. It's sort of this very aesthetic picture-making background into a more public space-oriented practice. And now I move between the kind of projects we've been talking about and also construction of gallery objects as well.
And you mentioned to me before we started taping that you have an exhibit at the DuPage.
Yeah, at the College of DuPage.
College
in
of
Glen Ellen.
DuPage. Why don't you
Sure,
talk
this
just
is
a bit
sure,
about
yeah. My work as an artist in the gallery context tends to look at our instruments of control and monitoring of other places and spaces. The control panels of science fiction movies, the warning signals in our buildings, the webcams we can look at online to see what's going on in other places, the kind of surveillance of data and people that help keep certain kinds of order in place. And so my project at the College of DuPage is 60 control panels on a big long wall, each one claiming to monitor some condition in the world through indicator lights. So each panel has a single big green light and a single big red light, and it trips between the green and the red based on the status of a condition listed on the panel. I can show you pictures of that too, actually. Might as well just pop them up here while we're mentioning it.
And for those who can't get themselves up to the College of DuPage gallery, the art and design faculty have an annual show. Is that usually in the fall?
Yep, it usually is, and I've had work related to this in that show as well.
So this coming fall at the Krannert Art Museum, not only Kevin's work, but other members of the faculty. So it's a good chance to see what everybody's doing.
It's up there. And I should mention, too, the Krannert Art Museum has been very supportive of all these projects of mine and the walking as well. They actually hosted one exhibition that was part of the Walking Symposium as well last year.
The Krannert Art Museum is really expanding a lot with computer art. In fact, I don't know if it's still there in the basement, but
the canvas,
the canvas
3D
is still there.
reality. But I've got these pictures up, if I can show you too, Patsy, just so you can see a little more.
There we go.
So these are these control panels, and it says under the green light, it says, "It will get better." And this one says, it's pretty bad. And then there's a switch here that the viewer can turn.
Turn?
Yeah.
And so is it interactive?
That part is.
If I were standing in front of it, I could Turn the switch.
And then there's a whole wall of these.
There it is. Okay.
So some of them you control, some of them are controlled outside of your, and you can't even guess. Like, how does it know? There's one, for example, that says inhale, exhale, and it's slowly turning back and forth. And so you think, who's inhaling, exhaling?
And especially if there's a crowd.
Yeah.
In front of it.
Right.
Who's controlling it?
Yeah. And there are some motion sensors that are monitoring people, but some of them are, to pull, show you the man behind the curtain. Some of them are just timers. Some of them are just clicking and switching.
So random. Random.
Random, or they're clicking on a rhythm that I've set that makes makes sense for that kind of phenomenon.
So will we be able to see any of this this coming fall?
Yeah, I'll certainly have part of this project.
Part of this project. So to our viewing audience, come fall, this is a good opportunity for you to see Kevin's work. I always like to ask my guests any recommendations of books.
Oh, yes.
People might be interested in reading. So a couple of those before we close off for the day.
The one that's really the great starting point to this whole way of looking at walking is by John Stilgoe.
Why don't you spell the last name for people?
It's Stilgoe.
Okay.
And he's a historian of landscape and a naturalist who teaches at Harvard. And this book is called, the title, I've got it on my website.
Quickly.
Sorry, quickly.
Well, while he's looking for that, as I always say, these books and publications can be found at our university library. And just to remind everybody, you're residents of the state of Illinois and you have open access to our library. Did you find it?
I did. It's called Outside Lies Magic.
Okay, Outside Lies Magic.
It's a short book, and it's just great. It's the first sentence is get out, walk, and it's about what you can learn from walking. And he has a chapter each on different phenomena that you'll see. He has a chapter on railroads and what you learn by walking around. You shouldn't walk on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, don't walk on.
Yeah, don't walk on the railroads. There's a chapter on power lines, and just about how once you start looking while you're walking, you learn about things, and it's really great, really quick read, and I use it in my freshman classes, even in my drawing classes here where I teach.
Oh, okay.
And it gets people right away thinking, wow. If I really look, there's going to be things I didn't notice around.
Great recommendation for our planning commissions and our city council members to.
I think so.
As a good read.
It'd be great to read together with the group and talk together about what you thought.
Absolutely.
Of it. That's a good entry point. Another one that's a little longer but a little more closer to some of the art side of this. There's a book called Wanderlust.
L-U-S-T.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Wanderlust, I guess we think of that as that kind of impulse to get out, right?
Walkabout.
Yep, definitely that. It's a history of walking is what she calls it, and the author's name is Rebecca Solnit, Solnit.
All right.
And she's in some ways an art critic by training, but she's written about all kind of things besides what we think of as art. And Wanderlust deals with everything from pilgrimage to I think where she ends with to the redesign of Paris and what walking was like in Paris after they invented the boulevard as an idea, and all sorts of things. So it's a good survey of walking.
And another one for our public officials and our citizen planners to capture. Well, Kevin has given us an awful lot to think about today and to integrate into just our daily lives. I really appreciate Kevin joining us today for community planning conversations. And remember, planning matters.